Today we are with an unusual guest, an Academy Award winner. We will be talking about the optics and the cinema camera filters. Eric, could you please introduce yourself and what do you do for business?
Hi, I'm Ira Tiffen. My last name has long been known in the motion picture, television, and photo-optical field as a manufacturer of optical accessories that produce special effects for motion pictures, television, still photography. And that's because my father founded the company and I'd worked in it for a very long time. Started when I was a kid, at age 6, sweeping floors. And then as I grew up, I wanted to be with him more and do some of the things that he was doing because he looked like he was having a good time. So that's what I've done for a very long time, up until fairly recently when I've taken over the last 10, 15 years, some detours, which we'll get to.
Great. So before we start getting into the most important information and the technical side of your work, can you show us the award and put it back on the desk, please?
Huh?
Yeah. Yeah, that golden award.
I have here a Primetime Emmy Award that I received along with my father, Nat Tiffen, and my brother, Steve Tiffen, in 1998 for the body of work that we had done in producing optical effects for television from the Television Academy of Arts and Sciences. This was a wonderful feeling to receive this and to receive the recognition of the industry.
And how do you feel about it right now?
Thrilled. It's nice to have something to look back on that clearly indicates a success, clearly indicates having had the opportunity to influence the work of others and the results of that work. So yeah, this is something that will stay with me, hopefully for a long time to come.
Yeah, okay. Then we will continue.
Please.
Yeah, great. So you had a long career of making specialized optical effects for still and motion imaging. Let me ask you, can you describe this journey and why is it important until now?
Sure. If you look at any movie you've seen or any TV show or even a TV commercial or sometimes even a documentary, although they tend not to use filters that much, they still use them sometimes. You will have seen the effects of filters in so many ways. For the most part, though, it's normal when you aren't aware that a filter is being used, because the best way for them to be used is to blend in naturally. And so if you're using an effect to make someone look younger, for instance, which is very often the case, not that every artist or actor needs that, but it's very often the case that when the cinematographer is using a filter to make someone look younger by smoothing the skin, you don't know that it's a special effect. If it's done well, especially well, it just looks like, yes, that's the way they normally look. And so one of the things I've done is to perfect ways of making people look younger, of doing things that otherwise could be very, very difficult. For instance, you're making a motion picture and you've got a production schedule to meet and the weather's not cooperating. And so you have a scene that takes place in a bright sunny day with a blue sky and it's overcast and it's raining. Well, years ago, working with film, it was important then to be able to take out a pale yellow filter that would take the overcast gray and blue gray and turn it into a warmer, more yellowish sunlit scene. And then on top of that, you could use a filter like this. This is a graduated color filter that, as you can see, takes the top part of the scene and makes it blue, like blue sky blue, and the bottom is clear. So if you have people with colors down here in their skin, they stay the same. They're not going to be colored blue, and you could put this exactly where you want it. This was made by one of the companies I worked at, my colleagues at Schneider Optics, which is where I was from 2012 to 2017. And they do a very nice job also of making these optics.
Oh yeah, that's great. So exactly like you put the actor like parallel to this area, to the area that smoothens the skins, but the other actors are like down a little bit.
Well, when you're dealing with a filter like that, with a color overall, you would position it in what's called a matte box, which is really a mechanical holder for square or round filters. But if they're square or rectangular, you can slide them up and down. And by doing that, you could position the point where the clear gradually, softly goes up to the color so that all the people are down here. And it's just this part is up where the clouds are. Maybe there's mountains in the background that would blend in, but you'd be shooting most of your scene on the ground where it shouldn't be blue down here. And the idea behind this filter is that this gradient here is very soft and smooth and easily blends into a lot of different types of scenes and looks very natural.
Oh yeah, that's so inspiring. So let's get into more technical sides here. What is diffusion, contrast, and the flare effects filters?
Well, when you're talking about making people look better, diffusion filters are the way to go. They take wrinkles and skin blemishes and fine details like that, and they soften them. They make them a little less sharp. Contrast is the difference between what you see in a bright sunny day versus an overcast cloudy day. Bright sunny day, the light outside comes from a light that's so far away, it's essentially like a point of light, the sun. When it's a point, it's called hard light because it casts hard shadows. And if you see your shadow in a bright sunny day, you'll be able to count your fingers if you hold your hand up because they'll all clearly be shown very sharply. The minute a cloud comes over, or if you have a lot of clouds, or if there's an overall cloud cover, the light from the sun bounces through various points in the cloud cover. And by the time it gets to the ground, it's reaching the ground from many different directions. So it's more diffuse, it's softer. In fact, when we make lights to use for portraits, we make them typically as soft lights, where the light source is deliberately bounced off many different points of reflection in the design of the light so that it produces a softer look. Now, that's not all they use. They use harder lights, and they also use filters for lighting too, which are typically not made out of glass like the ones I'm specialized in, but are typically filter gels, and I'll show you some of those later in another demonstration. But overall, trying to make someone look better involves softening fine details, potentially reducing the contrast where blacks are not so black, highlights are not so bright, and you have more shades of gray in between, and it looks more pleasant. Creating the reduction in contrast is the job of what are known as low contrast filters, and there's a variety of them. Most of them produce a small amount of what is another characteristic of these types of filters, and that is flare, producing a glow around a light. So let's say you have a candlelight and you want to create a romantic candlelight dinner, and you've got two people sitting at a table in a restaurant, two candles. Wouldn't it look much nicer if you could make it glow? Well, let's see. I may have something here that might do that. It's not the ideal filter for this, but this is a filter that actually produces an appearance of a smoke-filled room.
Oh yeah.
And if you were to have like a situation in a bar or a nightclub, and especially back in the days when everyone smoked, and depending on where you are, that may still be the case, you would have a room that would be potentially more like the appearance here. And you remove the filter, it doesn't look that way. In the same way, we could make, there's many filters that we make that produce a warm glow around a highlight like a candle. And in doing that, it looks emotionally more romantic. It's a nice sense that when you watch a movie, a lot of what people think is, yeah, that's a movie effect, but not when they're watching it. What they think afterwards, they say, that was a cinematic effect because it somehow made the movie look different from your regular snapshots that most people take at home to record such events where you don't have as much effort being put into the emotional content of the image. So playing around with light, playing around with highlights and shadows and bright areas and flare, creating a glow, these are all things that I specialize in. Before we go further, I wanted to add something to colors that I didn't get to talk about, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
I have another filter here, which is what you would use if you didn't have a dramatic sunset or even a sunrise. And so you could put this in front of the camera and you would wind up being able to make it look, by moving it up or down, make it look more like a brilliant sunset or sunrise. Now, these things have been around a long time, and working with film, this was the best way to do it. But when you have today digital means of manipulating the image, one of the key elements here is color. Digital imagery can deal with color quite effectively. And so a filter like these would typically not be used as much today for digital imaging, but a filter like this, which is simply a neutral density gray where it darkens but doesn't change the color at the top, these are what are still used for digital to a great extent, because digital cameras can have a problem with bright sunlight and dark shadows where the sunlit areas can be overexposed. And so by reducing some of the light with a filter like this, a graduated color filter that has a neutral density, which doesn't have a color, it's more like a sunglass lens that you might wear. This is still very important for digital. And I did want to add something. Years ago, like 40 years ago, I used to love this filter for taking pictures. It's kind of a brownish tone, and obviously the scene here isn't suggestive of it, but I would use this to take pictures and make an area, a space, a room, a building look more like it was in the 1800s. It's a warm brown sepia filter that has a fog component in it, and it can flare lights as well as giving you that brown tone. This kind of effect too is more typically done digitally in correcting the final image in the computer after it's been shot.
So my next question is, what have you studied and what did you need to read to be able to understand how these filters and how these hues of light work?
Well, I mentioned as a kid, I watched my dad, and I started working with him when I was in high school. And he worked in a lab. And what he did there was he would produce the laminated filter glass that most of the filters that we made, and which Schneider also, many of their filters are made this way, but using different chemistry, out of 2 clear layers of glass that are bonded together with a permanent cement that is optically clear, but into which you can incorporate color or effect. So you would have glass on the outside and a very thin filters. So the glass in here, for instance, isn't this color. What is the color is the bonding layer in between 2 pieces of clear glass. And one of the reasons my father had gotten recognition for this of significance, that worked? Well, I took a look at what my dad did. He seemed to be having a good time. And as I grew up, I sought to work with him as much as I could. And so I worked there through high school when I had holidays and summer vacations. And I worked with him in a lab. In that lab, he used chemistry to produce the effects that we then turned out as finished product by taking 2 layers of clear glass and bonding them permanently together with a cement that was optically clear, but into which you could incorporate color or other materials that would create diffusion and contrast effects. So I went to school, NYU, for chemical engineering so that I had a better understanding of working in a lab. And then I spent my time working there, learning how filters are made, learning how colors are mixed, and then eventually developing my own ways of doing these things so that I could produce a broad range of product that has been out there since about 50 years now. It's about when I got started. One of the things I did want to add was, here's an example of this process of taking 2 layers of clear glass, bonding them together with a color in between. Because what you're seeing here, as with any of the colors that I've been showing, and pretty much all of the filters that have even diffusion and contrast effects and flare effects, is the result of that lamination process, where you've got 2 layers of clear glass bonded with a color or an effect. And that's what's happening here. The glass itself in this is not brown. This is a filter that I used to love when I was much younger. And it was what we call the sepia 3. It has the effect of producing a warm brown tone and a softening of lights and flare of lights. Kind of like old photographs or a period timepiece where you might be telling a story that happened in the 1800s or the early 1900s. And I used to like to shoot through this a lot, and it was just very nice. But an effect like this today would more often be done in the computer, in the work involved with fine-tuning the image to its best look. And color is one of those things that is more easily done digitally than certain other effects, which still need to be done optically. Diffusion effects, neutral density filters that I mentioned with that graduated color. Those things are still very important, especially now with digital cameras, because they have a different way of dealing with light than film does.
And so what are the differences between using filters, according to your experience, in capture and in post treatment? And what is in capture and what is in post?
You're dealing with the 2 key portions of production of a TV show, a motion picture, where you've got production, which is the making of the images, and post-production, where it's putting together all the different pieces that you produced when you're out there with your cameras and the actors shooting them. In post-production, that's where you're putting it all together into a finished piece. So that's where the editing is, that's where the color grading is, that's where everything is turned into a final form for distribution. So you've got 2 types of technology you're dealing with. On the one hand, in production, you're dealing with what you can do in the camera. And there are things, a lot of things you can do in the camera, especially as cameras have become so capable today, that you need to know in order to make a really good image. They handle, it's actually far more complicated than it used to be with film, because there's so many different variables today between the types of cameras and the way in which they work and the formats they have and the resolution and the dynamic range and all sorts of things. These are all things that if you decided to get into this field, you would need to learn more about, but really isn't something I'm prepared to discuss at length here, and it really isn't my forte. But I have been dealing with optics for enhancing these technologies, film and digital, for producing images, in the sense that optics has their strongest influence when you're dealing with the camera, what's happening with the camera. You wouldn't, for instance, take a filter, a glass filter, and hold it up in front of a computer and say, unless it had a camera on it that you were using, and say, here, this is the effect, because it wouldn't understand. But put that filter in front of a camera, in front of a lens, and then record light coming through it. See, filters are light manipulators. And I see much of what I've done in my career as a filter manufacturer and designer is manipulating light in ways that are advantageous to people looking to tell stories. And so production, it's what you can do in the camera. Post-production is when you're done with that, everything else that has to happen. So imagine if you're in post-production and the images that you're given are somehow lacking in detail, in the shadows, detail in the highlights, or if the color is way off, or if you don't have all of the quality that you should have at the start of the editing process, your job can be an awful lot harder. And so the cinematographer or the cameraman, in other instances, would have to make sure that they did everything they could to give the editor in post-production the best result, the best opportunity to create the best result, but the best result from production. And so using filters helps them do that. Using filters in production also helps the cameraman, the cinematographer, to maintain more control over the effect. If it is an effect that can be put in digitally afterwards, it's something that someone else would do. The cameraman wouldn't do that. So leaving it to post-production might mean it's not going to happen at all, or it's not going to happen the way you envision it. So post and production are opportunities for different people with different job responsibilities to control the appearance of the image. And so they have different tools, different technologies, they overlap in some ways, but the key element here is when you're working as a cameraman in production, you have the infinite range of the real world as your raw material to start with. You have the brightness, the brilliance of the sun and the deepest, darkest shadows. You have every color imaginable to start with. But the minute you take what you've recorded and hand it over to editing in post-production, you are limited by what's been recorded and by the range of color and contrast of the recorded medium, which is always less than the real world. So despite there being some potential negatives to doing things that you can't replicate it precisely what the real world is, it still works. We still make it work, It's something that has functioned for decades, and we still come up with new and better ways of making it more involving, of bringing the viewer in, making them more aware of what they're seeing as a potential replica for reality or replacement for reality. And so it's an exciting business. The technology is enthralling, and every day new things are introduced to make it even more so. But those are how I would perceive production and post-production in their various roles as combined producing the net result that we need.
Yeah, you have mentioned cinematographers. What is your contribution to the American Cinematographer Manual?
Okay. Well, let's start with the organization that puts out the manual, the American Society of Cinematographers, otherwise known as the ASC. 100 years old and has been the leader in bringing cameramen, cinematographers, directors of photography together to work toward sharing knowledge so that everyone can benefit. And there are examples of what is in America known as, of course, the American cinematographer, the organizations around the world. But me growing up in the US, I was made a member in 1992, an associate member of the ASC. But in 1988, I began contributing to the American Cinematographer Manual, which was a great honor and a privilege for me. It was something that I was very proud of and still am. We have most recently published the 10th edition, and there's work on the 11th. I've already contributed what I needed. The American Cinematographer Manual has most recently, a few years ago, produced the 10th edition, and has been the members of the society have been working on the newer one, which isn't out yet at this time, the 11th edition. I've already contributed my part to the camera filter section, which I have been writing since 1988. It's one of the great joys of my professional life to be able to contribute what I can to the general knowledge amongst all of us, which was the reason for the ASC to get its start.
Yeah, and what are your main highlights or your main contributions to the latest manual?
I have been editing and writing the section on camera filters, which is the product that I've been making for decades, so that we put together knowledge that cameramen at every level has an opportunity to learn from. It includes advice, tips, descriptions and pictures that go over the range of things that people need to know.
Oh, wow.
We have here the 10th edition, the one that's most recently out in print. And as I mentioned, the 11th is on its way. And in here, the camera filter section is here. And it's kind of like an encyclopedia of technique and technology. So it covers all the things that you, in this section, all the things that you can do with filters. And yet everywhere else in the book, it covers everything from cameras to lighting to support structures like tripods and dollies and Steadicams and other things that make up the full range of production tools that cinematographers use and need to know about. And so if you're trying to understand how a certain technology works, this is an excellent book to do that with. It's got the greatest contributors who are members of the society typically, who have been spending their lives in learning. And we all, each of us, want to share what we have learned with others.
Yeah, wait, Era, can you open the book again? Era? Yeah,
Sure.
Can you open the book? I want to see a page where your name is written. I want a page with your name.
It's right there.
Yeah, a little forward. Yeah, a little forward. Yeah, perfect. Got it.
Good enough. Should I put it back now?
Yes, you can put it back.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's go to the next part. What are your patents in photo accessory design?
Well, I have 4. The first 2 are related to the same product. And if you are at all familiar with filters, you might recognize the ring that's on here. It's typically in aluminum, sometimes it's made of brass, where it's got a female thread on one side and a male thread on the other. The male thread would fit into the camera lens, which usually has a thread on it. And then you could put another filter on it by threading it into here. And some 30 years ago, I thought that threading these accessories on would be more trouble than I'd like to do sometimes, even though it works really well in terms of once it's on solidly, you can get it off, but it does take some time. And I thought that maybe there was a way to make it easier. But knowing that there's a lot of threaded filters out there already, I wanted to come up with something that would allow you to take a filter and snap it in place and just click to take it off. And so I did that. This is the first page of the patent. And it shows a ring here that is made of plastic instead of metal. And it has two sections with little tabs that stick out. You might be familiar with the concept like this of a lens cap, but most lens caps have mechanisms in them that include multiple parts to them. And they're not able to be clear in the center because they're not designed to be. They're designed to be protective of the whole lens, so they're opaque. But I needed to do something that would give a spring tension without having to use up the space in the center, like most lens caps did. So by having these little sections here,
yeah, I can see them,
that you could press in, and it would remove a portion of the thread that engages the other, either the camera or the other filter that's on there. You could take it out. And then by putting it back in, you would simply just squeeze them a little and it would snap in place. So it was almost instant. You didn't have to thread them at all. And the way the tension was adjusted, you could actually use this to rotate. There are some filters that benefit from rotating, like polarizers, which their effect is different depending on whether they're turned one way or another. And so this would let you do that. And while we never put this into full production with actual filters, we did take the concept and use this in several products, one of which was used for Kodak. And actually two of them were used for Kodak, one for underwater filtering, where they had designed a film for shooting underwater and needed a special filter for the strobe lights that worked with it, which cameramen underwater use to illuminate when there's not enough sunlight coming through the water. And this technique allowed us to design a mount for that would make it very easy for a cameraman working underwater to change filters, put one on, remove it with one hand underwater, which was one of the things that they were looking for. Anyway, that was the first patent that I had. The second version of this was simply a design patent. There's two types of patents typically. I mean, there's others, but the main ones would be a utility patent, which covers the basic mechanism, and a design, which covers more than anything, covers the look, the way it appears. And at the time, I applied for and received both of those. Now, square and rectangular filters, as I mentioned earlier, have long been used in cinematography, especially for their ability to be moved up and down as well as rotated. So that when you have like a half color, half clear filter, you can position that line in the middle up or down to match where it needs to be in the scene. Well, I had designed, along with a co-inventor, Eric Seeger, to produce an effect here of, like I did with the snap-in filter, make a filter something that you could add immediately. What typically happens in matte boxes or motion pictures is the glass does not go directly into the holder, it goes into what's called a frame. And the frame puts a border around the filter and a handle. So you have to take the filter, put it in the frame, and then take the frame and slide it in to the slots in a matte box that's in front of the lens. What I did with Eric's help was to take that filter and allow it to be slid directly into the mechanism that holds it in front of the lens itself without going in the frame first. And the key to it was you had to make sure that without the frame and the handle, you could still control where the filter was. So we did that with a rubber wheel that once the filter came in, it engaged these two pins. And by turning this rubber wheel, you could dial in the position of the filter. But these two pins served a very important purpose. They're spring-loaded. And once the filter went down to a certain point, the one on the top would come in, it would lock the position of the wheel. So you couldn't have the filter drop out the bottom, because that was another thing that filter frames prevented. So this mechanism actually worked very well. We sold a number of these, but ultimately we decided not to pursue this on a long-term basis. But I thought that it was something that worked very well, and a lot of people liked it. And then finally, more recently, this was 16 years ago, 2004, I had an idea, and that idea was augmented by an old friend and former colleague at Tiffen, Lee Bowden, who had contributed a portion of the concept, to take a tripod, and the handle that controls the tripod would encase in this portion of it a small tripod. And that small tripod could be used as an accessory for the main tripod, or as simply something that if you need to take your camera and place it on the ground or very low or on a table directly, and you don't need the full larger tripod itself, this would give you an extra tripod, so to speak, that was always with you. And this was called the Switch Grip, and it did very well in the marketplace. I've invented other things and created things I'm very proud of, not necessarily the subject of today's talk, but which we didn't go for patents for because of, in some instances, there were things that we didn't want other people to know how it was done. My father had not patented his process for lamination because if you patent it, you have something that you have to explain exactly how it's done, and everybody knows it. But they can't use it, at least not legally, for upwards of 20 years typically. But after that, it's public knowledge. And that is something that we decided not to pursue a patent on. And there's other things that I've developed that might have warranted a patent, but we didn't pursue that because we wanted to keep the technology to ourselves.
Yeah, that's a perfect decision. So my next question is, like, you have been dealing with these lenses and with these optics in with the traditional, let's say, machinery for photographing and for the cinema. How does your industry now fit with the new technology?
Well, as I said, that there are things that change. When we went from film to digital, some of the things that film required, digital doesn't. And some of the things that film didn't have as much of a need for, digital does. So working with neutral density filters that reduces the amount of light without changing the color coming in is very important today, even so. There are some effects you can't, at least not yet, do digitally. I'm not sure all of the effects a polarizer will do can ever be done digitally, but I'm not going to make a statement that says, no, that's never going to happen. The reason is I have been amazed at the technology that's constantly developed around us, and it's not, I have no desire to anticipate any shortcomings in their abilities. But in the meantime, polarizers are kind of like polarized sunglass lenses, where they have the ability to reduce reflected glare off of windows and water, and they can make color of the blue sky look much deeper and color of green grass and bright sunlight look much deeper. And it can also remove reflections that might make it hard for you to see through a window or beneath the surface of water. And so polarization allows you to record details that would be totally gone or largely missing from the original image if you didn't use a polarizer that you could not put in digitally afterwards. So that's one of the differences between production and post where if you don't have the details or you don't have enough to give the editor afterwards, to enough material to work on, to work with, then you've lost something. And knowing when you need to use an optical filter in production so that post-production get the effect that's needed is an important part of the process. So colors are different. As I mentioned earlier, colors are something that can more readily be done digitally, and it's easier to create things like graduates, where it's one part color, part clear, and it's a soft gradient in between. You can do that digitally very well, and for the most part, that's how people create those effects today. I know when I first created the machinery to do that some decades ago, they were very, very popular for a very long time. And even today, there are still some people that prefer to use them, but this is something that has changed. Diffusion, contrast, control, creating flare. You can do that in some ways digitally, but there hasn't been a really precise replication of the optical effect. It's been done to an extent that is often used and used successfully, but if you wanted to get the exact type of effect that is produced with an optical component like an optical filter, that's a little bit beyond what people have been doing digitally. So whether that'll happen or not, I'm eager to see it, and that's something I'm interested in. Otherwise, I guess the key difference is that what you have with film is a chemistry process. You're dealing with the ability of dyes to be affected by light, and the mechanism for doing that is different than the way digital cameras are affected by light and the way they see colors. And the sensors and the film have different characteristics. And so more than anything, those are what are key to the differential between them. But there's so many different ways of manipulating digital imagery. There have been many ways of manipulating film as well, but digital offers, it seems, a broader range of opportunities that are, again, one of the key differences between the changes in technology. I think there's more opportunities now than we used to think back when we first started seeing digital cameras, and we're saying these effects, some people said, will never match that of film. Well, that has long since happened in some ways. There are still some things that some people believe film is better at and is perhaps in their opinion always going to be better at, and I won't say no to that. I will say that there are plenty of movies out there done in film that are absolutely magnificent, but it's also true of digital imagery today. Everybody has to find what works best for them, but it's great to have both options.
Yeah, perfect. So my next question is, you are a great magician. How do you manipulate colors?
If you'd like to phrase it that way, that's fine. I won't argue.
Okay, so yeah, how do you manipulate colors and how do you produce this magic?
This is something that I grew up doing, because the most popular filters that I was making when I first started working were colors. They were colors for doing all kinds of things. They were colors for allowing film, which had to be designed chemically for a particular quality of light. So there was film for outdoors in sunlight, there was film for indoors in incandescent light, and for other applications. The film didn't have the ability, like digital does, to conform to whatever light is going on there in some way. So they needed optical filters for it. In fact, going back to the early 1900s, when George Eastman was building Kodak up, a company that he famously founded, he made sure that he'd hired people who were capable of making filters, especially color filters, to enable his film to have as much application as possible out there in the real world. So it's long been through the 1900s and into, to some degree, the 2000s, a key component of optical filter manufacturing. It has diminished recently, but it was what I really got started in 50 years ago. And so what I did was I produced colors that allowed you to get different effects, some of which I described earlier, when you want to create a more sunlit day appearance on an overcast day, or sometimes you want to do the reverse. You can create a nighttime that you shoot during the day, which sometimes is done for production scheduling purposes, and sometimes it's done simply because you have more control over the lighting when you do that. You can actually put a filter over the lens and playing around with exposure that will produce the look of moonlight from when it's actually sunny out. It's called day for night. All of these, by the way, all these things I'm talking about are things you can read about in the American Cinematographer Manual. So I have some examples here of some colors that would give you a better understanding of how colors work. Let's start off with a yellow. When we have yellow, it's a portion of the spectrum that happens to look like what we know as yellow. If we were to add a purple to it, what do we think we might get? Well, I hope you can see this, because what it produces, yellow and purple, is red. Because the purple, in this case, a color we call magenta, is made up of portions of the spectrum that tend to appear reddish and bluish. But when we put yellow over it, it tends to reduce or eliminate the amount of blue in it. And so what you're left with is red. Okay, so now let's take the purple out. And we'll put in a blue-green color known as cyan. We'll put this here. And what might we get if we put the yellow in front of it? Well, you can see we get a brilliant green. Because again, we start off with a bluish green, we put yellow in front of it, which absorbs the blue, and you wind up with what's left is green.
Okay.
And then let's see what happens if we put this blue-green here and this blue-red. The green and the red cancels out, and you wind up with a deep blue. I hope you can see that it's really dark. So we can create out of cyan, magenta, and yellow, which, by the way, are the colors that are printed in magazines and what you see when you look at TV screens often, that produce all these other colors. But what happens when you add all of them together? And you take the magenta and the cyan, which gives you blue, and you put the yellow over it. Well, then you get something that essentially is black because you've absorbed all the colors. And this is a technique also used in printing, where sometimes they'll print images using halftone dot screen, which is another technology that is quite interesting and been around a long time, without black actually, but produce black using mixing different colors. So I would work with colorants, typically dyes, because dyes tend to be more transparent than pigments, which is what's used in paint, to create colors like these that had specific applications. And when Eastman long ago had Mr. Ratton create a range of what we have known as Rattan colors. He gave them all numbers, and they all have specific characteristics, how much light they absorb in different parts of the spectrum, that those colors became useful for certain applications. And what I was doing was what my father had started before me, is in using colorants like dyes to replicate colors that had importance in imagery, in either still or motion imagery.
Yeah, that is wow. That's a great era. Okay, so how were you awarded for these achievements?
Well, the situation of my father developing a series of techniques that culminated in the production of a system for manufacturing his laminated filters resulted in a product that far surpassed anything that had gone on before it. It had exceptional durability. It had very accurate color and the ability to replicate other effects as well, very consistently and precisely. And it was capable of producing a finished product that was glass, because glass has the ability to produce sharper images typically than plastic. I had produced a line of plastic square and rectangular filters for professional motion picture and television use back in the early 80s at the request of one of our large international distributors. And I was reluctant initially because I thought it wasn't going to be as good a product. But I did it, and we learned that the fact is I was right. But the reason I mention it is because one of the things I attempted to do was to utilize the methods that we use for making glass have really fine optical resolution capability. I used similar materials and techniques and equipment to make plastic filters, which was the kind of plastic that you use they used even today on eyeglasses. And we could never quite get it as good, which meant that if you looked at the image critically, if you used a very long lens, like a telescopic lens, telephoto lens, and it had to make a high resolution image of something very far away, it's more challenging. And if you do that through a resin filter, it's typically not as sharp. The detail is sometimes lost. Glass, you could keep all the detail that you started out with. And so being able to do precise colors and such was a big deal when my father started doing that. And so he had been awarded an Academy Award for technical achievement. And subsequently, some years later, it was upgraded to a scientific award. The Technical Achievement Award is something that looks like this one here, which I was fortunate enough to obtain for myself for the production of the ultra contrast filter series, which I have an example I can show you. But my dad's first award looked like this. It was a certificate. And his subsequent award, they deemed what he had done in originating the laminating process was that important that it was upgraded. And his award has a wood base, a small Oscar statuette, and a small brass plaque. It's really quite beautiful.
Can you push the picture? Era, please, Era. Era, can you hear me? Yeah, can you push the certificate towards the camera?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, a little lower. Got it. Okay. Yeah.
The ultra contrast filter was a concept I had come up with that was able to take light in a scene and take it from highlights and put it into shadows in a unique way. I'll just put one on here really briefly and then take it off. I'm in a room which is white, but it's evenly illuminated and there's not a lot of high contrast. There's not a lot of deep shadows. But if you put a filter like this onto the lens when you had bright sunlight out, you could add some of the light from the bright sunlight into the shadows and make more detail in the shadows visible to the camera. And so it did this without creating any highlight flare, which had never been done before. I introduced it back in 1988, and 4 years later, we had determined that it was in use in about 50% of all Hollywood production. And it was at that point that it was considered for and won the Technical Achievement Award that I showed you here, which was really, really a wonderful experience that it's significant to have been recognized by people in the industry who are just as knowledgeable and capable and talented and brilliant as anybody to say, hey, I did something really cool. That was great.
So let's fly into the next step of magic and go to the art glass sculpture. What is a glass artist and what exactly did you do?
Well, art takes many forms, as we know. And art can be something that we consider a spider web glistening in the sunlight as art. And the spider that wove that web, the artist. But with people, we have a broad range of materials to work with. We could work with finger paints when we're young or even older. People make art out of yarn lint from dryers, laundry dryers. They put certain types of fabrics in there and then they collect the lint and then they weave it into art. Paint of all kinds, of course, has been used as a basis for art, and many materials, sculpture out of all kinds of things, steel, iron, stone of various kinds, concrete, and glass. Glass has been, of course, something central to my life for a very long time. And I thought that if I wanted and had an opportunity to use glass to create art, I would do it. And so I had an opportunity to about a decade ago, and I tried it out. I had some ideas in my head, and I based my concept on something called cold working. There's different kinds of glass art, and a lot of it has to do with molten glass, melting glass, making glass slump in a furnace or in a kiln. And it's the kind of thing that I hadn't had experience with, so I was less expecting to get involved in. As cold working, because cold working is the kind of work I did making filters, only I wasn't doing it to create art. I was hoping the cinematographers would create the art using it. So in essence, I viewed what I was doing as sort of making paints for them. So when it came time for me to make something, I said, well, I want to use the concept of taking flat sheets of glass, clear glass, and putting them together, but I wanted to put something in the middle that would have some importance and be intriguing. So the first piece I made was something I did in 2008. And actually, to my pleasant surprise, I was picked up by a glass gallery in New Jersey called Mostly Glass, Sammy Harawi, and is the owner of it. And he had kindly taken me to a big show just a few months after meeting me and seeing my first piece called SOFA, Sculptural Objects and Functional Art in Chicago. And lo and behold, that piece sold. It was exciting. Let me show you what that is a bit more closely. This is about 35 pounds of solid glass. And it is about 3 inches thick. It's made up of 10 sheets of glass that are each about 1/4 of an inch thick, all clear. And on each layer, I have printed using screen printing techniques, 4 different colored patterns. And what you're seeing here is 4 different locations. I call this location, 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 the real estate agent's mantra. And specifically left out a 4th location because what I did was recreate the look and feel, in my mind, of 3 natural environments, locations, alongside and juxtaposed against man-made, colored differently. They all have the same luminance value, meaning they all reflect the same amount of light, but different portions of the spectrum are predominant in each one. That's why this is green and the others have the colors they have. But this is a grassy hillside with trees on it. This is a canyon. And this is water. In fact, if you take the equivalent of sunlight, a point of light, or take it out in sunlight, and you move it, the shadows that the upper layers of the patterns create against the bottom layers create an effect known as a moire effect. And it actually makes the waves look like they're moving. And then down here, while the buildings don't actually match reality, the basic structure of the streets, this is Park Avenue here with the island in the center, and this is about 36th Street. The proportions of the streets are based on that portion of central Manhattan. And it was a lot of fun putting little details into the buildings, and you can sort of get lost in it sometimes if you're feeling so inclined. But this piece was an exciting thing to do because it came out very much like what I anticipated in my head. But it had, of course, the benefit of being real because I could see more clearly that when you look at it on the edge, it's all clear because all the colors are just very thin layers. But when you look at it more like this, it's much more solid looking. So anyway, this was the first piece that I made. I made several of them, sold 3 of them. And the way that was done is to make it a little more clear. Layers of clear glass. I'd create the pattern in the computer, and then I'd create a screen for screen printing, and I would take special ink that I would screen this pattern on to the layer that it was needed to be on. And then other layers would have other shapes and patterns on them. And then they would be, whoops, I have to keep the order of them better. But you can see how you can build up layers and create the kind of effect that I have in that piece there individually. So they would each be optically cemented with clear cement, one at a time, to build up the effects.
You mentioned that you used a certain principle building these pictures. What is the name of the principle again?
Okay. Central to the types of work that I produce using this technique of laminating clear glass with different patterns in between the layers is the fact that I'm taking 2-dimensional objects, the flat patterns that I just showed you in those small pieces, and I'm building them up vertically to create a depth that gives them 3-dimensionality. They're not just flat and long and wide, they're also high. And so the 3 dimensions makes that work look more interesting, more intriguing, looks different than just looking at, say, a flat painting, where 3-dimensionality is suggested by shading and illumination and the size of objects and the way things that are farther away might be in a lower contrast haze. But here I'm creating 3-dimensionality for real. It's not quite like a hologram, which is something else I've worked in the past. It's definitely real, but it is more like, say, stereolithography, as it used to be called, that we 3D print things with today. Except in this case, each of the layers is very thin, thinner than what a typical 3D printing layer might be, depending on what you're making, what material you're using. But I did this a decade ago, thinking that it gave me the opportunity to play around with depth. When you look at something and you have two eyes to see stereoscopically, your brain can sense from the difference between this eye and that eye, what it sees from two different distances and how the image changes accordingly. It senses the ability to gauge how far away an object is. Depth perception, we call it. And so I'm playing around with that with this. In some of my other work, I work with moire effects more, where it produces a blinking of the luminance of light that is being reflected from the piece. So it makes it look like there's a hum of energy going through it as you move. Other pieces, you see different things from different angles, and there's a message in one of them that you can only see from a very specific angle. And so it causes people to move around, and because they see letters and that look like words, and by moving around, ultimately it draws them in, only to be told by the piece, I like how you look at me, is the message. And so they're rewarded with an interactive event that they were generally not expecting. And then there's another piece that I created that its appearance is that of a hedgerow maze, a maze that you'd have to walk through to find your way from one side to the other or from inside to out. And there's actually three-dimensional people in that maze. And it produces an effect very much like looking down on a maze that you might find in a field. And you can take your time figuring your way around it. And you could see the little people that are in there all three-dimensionally. So it's been an intriguing way of envisioning something that I'd like to put in my home, and other people in some instances have chosen to do that. But I've been away from doing this for several years because I got back into making filters, and I still do some of that. But what I'm looking to do in the near future is to take some new technology based on what I've shown you here that goes in some other directions with my art. So it's something that I'm very much looking forward to be doing.
Yeah, it has been more than amazing, more than magical and fantastic talking to you, Era, and knowing about your great achievements and secrets. I really appreciate this time with you. Thank you so much indeed for that.
Thank you, Nour. I appreciate that time too.